It was a wobbly and bumpy ride as the carriage recklessly rolled down the neglected road. A nervous Ray nibbled at her nails as she looked through the window trying to distract herself. Alongside, cigar between his lips, sat a somber man gazing at the anxious girl. That man is her older brother, Hayes. We'll go back once things get better, I promise. He tried to placate her. However, seeing Ray silent, that made Hayes angry. Why aren't you answering me? He said to Ray. He felt it was about time she snapped out it. She was making a mountain out of a molehill. Ray so wanted to retort, but she didn't want to argue with Hayes. They were at war with the neighboring country. The economic recession that came with it was weighing down on everyone. Their father passed away, leaving behind debts and more debts. And their mother went into recuperation from the shock. As if things weren't bad enough, her brother fell victim to fraud. Now, not only are they homeless, they also have to pay their debts. Her brother understood her worries. But he didn't want her to lose hope, not yet. Ray stopped fiddling with her fingers. Her brother seemed like he'd slap her soon. She took a deep breath and went back to looking at the passing scenery. Anyway, aren't they a noble family? Why do they have a manor in the middle of nowhere? I wouldn't be surprised if a farmer came out to greet us, Hayes said in a mocking tone. Hayes. Ray raised her voice. She thought her brother was going overboard now, forgetting about the position they were in and acting all hoity-toity. I'm just being honest. Sometimes you have to say how things are, Hayes said to Ray. Please don't say that in front of them. Ray replied to Hayes. She hated how he looked down upon people. You think I'm idiot? See now, this is your problem. You don't get the reality behind those snobby nobles. Forget it. I'm wasting my time talking to an illegible country bumpkin, Hayes said while letting out a sigh. An illegible country bumpkin. His nickname for her pricked her where it hurt the most. You're the reason why I can't read Hayes. Ray replied to Hayes' words. This is because every tutor who comes will always be harassed by Hayes. And that causes all the tutors to stop teaching Ray. Again with the blames. Nobody's at fault here but your ignorance. If you had the ability, you could have learned at least foreign languages. He glowered at her, eyes seething with fury. One more word from her and he'd raise his hand. This wasn't the first time Ray had to keep her mouth shut as grief plagued her due to the unfair treatment. She bit down on her lip, an attempt to avoid retaliating. But Hayes didn't slap her. He tried to control his anger. Ray breathed a sigh of relief. This wasn't the first time Hayes did that. Every time she responded to Hayes' words, if not slapped, then Hayes would yell at her. Ugh, even the weather's nasty. Nothing is pleasant here. It had started raining a while ago, so Ray had opened her window to listen to the lovely pitter-patter of raindrops hitting the ground. But Hayes's remarks marred her mood. She slammed it shut. We're here. The coachman informed them. Finally, the finical Hayes deigned to look outside, albeit the first time. They were before a path that led to an overgrown forest. It was too narrow for the carriage to pass through. This road could be traversed only by foot or horseback. As inconvenient as it already was, it was raining. To top it, there was no one outside to welcome them. The situation couldn't get any worse. Hayes called the coachman to drop them off further inside. He found it quite difficult to walk with their luggage in the heavy rain. However, because the way Hayes called him was a bit rude, he refused Hayes' request. Well, that's your problem, he said to Hayes. What? Hayes was fuming. Honestly, had I known this place was this far into the mountains, I would have asked for more. You should be grateful I even came this far. The coachman spared no curtsies now that he was assured he had nothing to gain from Hayes anymore. Watch your mouth. We're already paid you, and this is how you treat us. You're just a lowly peasant dragging this piece of crap. Hayes said as he got off the carriage. Well, that piece of crap got you this far. The driver angrily threw their luggage to the ground. Heish rushed to save the bags from being muddied while Ray got down from the carriage. "You still think you're so high and mighty when you haven't got a dime in your pocket," said the coachman as he clicked his tongue and then left them. Hay was furious. Nobody had dared to ridicule him like this before. But the carriage was long on its way now, he could do nothing. Ray salvaged the remaining bags and approached her still raging brother. "Come on, let's get inside or we'll get sick," he said to Hayes. The siblings made their way down the narrow path in silence, Heish because of his bad mood and Ray because she was afraid of stoking the fire. Some time later, they reached the manor. Ray and Hayes were stunned to see the beauty of the manor in front of them. The walls were covered with sensuous roses and even the flag waving with the heavy winds looked dignified. The two siblings then entered towards the manor. Soon, they found themselves before a huge, closed door. Two candelabrums, sitting taut on the stone wall, adorned its either side. Heish took a deep breath, grabbed the lion, shaking it in desperation as if attempting to break in. However, no one answered their knock. "Hayes, maybe we're at the wrong place," said Ray nervously. Looking at the situation, it was quite possible. "Open this door. Do you realize what we had to go through to come all the way here?" Hayes knocked on the door angrily. Right then, a sound of rotten wood scratching against the floor resonated throughout the manor. The firmly shut doors finally opened and an old man with a nasty expression stuck his head out. "Who is it?" A cold voice that made people shut their mouths, raised eyebrows that seemed unsatisfied with everything, dark, sharp menacing eyes, and a face teeming with viciousness. In just one glance, one could tell that the old man wasn't exactly welcoming towards strangers. Hayes tried to calm himself down, and introduced himself as Hayes Lisbon. "I'm here to see the master of this household," he said while looking for the letter he was carrying. "I've never heard of the name of Lisbon from our family," said the old man and told them to go back. Before the old man left, Ray called him and handed him a letter. "Please, could you give this to His Grace? It's the least you can do for us," said Ray to the old man. But, instead of accepting the letter, the old man merely stared at Ray. He kept at it for a long time, amplifying the hostility and discomfiture. "Come inside," he said shortly after. Ray thanked the old man. However, Hayes with his rude attitude did not thank him. He even called the old man to prepare his room and bath. Seeing Hayes' attitude, Ray flushed with embarrassment. "How about you, lady? Would you need extra clothes and amenities for your bath?" asked the old man to Ray. "Can we see the Lord first?" she asked. "In that state?" The old man looked at her, amused. "Then can you deliver the letter to him first?" Ray said while holding back her shame. Just then, the sound of glasses clinking, and a tantalizing aroma reached Ray. Her mouth reflexively watered. As if on cue, her stomach rumbled, her eyes glanced upstairs. A puddle formed around her feet as the droplets fell from her wet hair, trickling down her bosom, making their way to the ground by way of her clothes. The man's lips rested on the tip of the glass in his hand. His gaze ran down her figure, from the damp blonde hair to her feet trembling from the cold. He didn't bother trying to hide his gaze. As their eyes met, the man softly licked his lips. "Master, this here is Hayes Lisbon and," the old man let his words hang as he turned around to look at Ray, asking for her name. Ray then introduced herself as Ray Lisbon. "They brought this letter." The old man carefully handed over the letter to his master. "Elliot Wester." Those were the first words he spoke after looking at the letter. "That's our grandfather who passed away last year. He's said to have helped your family in the past. As you may know, our family has recently gone through some issues. So my sister and I are looking for a place to stay temporarily. You understand this may seem abrupt, but would you allow us to stay in this manor for a couple of nights?" Hayes said without caring about the people around him. Hayes wanted to continue his words, but the man in front of him cut him off. The man twisted his neck, as if uncomfortable. Then said, "By the way, your sister pretty, is she engaged?" he said to Hayes. "Pardon?" Hayes was taken aback by the sudden words. "Is she engaged?" asked the man again. As the stunned Hayes stuttered, the man slowly descended the stairs. Earlier, his true nature was hidden by the shadows. But as he walked into the light, his full form came into view. The man was astonishingly tall, a ring of yellow encircled his sharp pupils. Those eyes, instead of a human, they belonged to a beast. Even the usually arrogant Hayes stood speechless upon seeing him. "Are you?" the man asked Ray after he came close to her. He looked right at her. The man was holding a cup of wine. His gaze drifted down her face and remained fixed on Ray's lips. "No," answered Ray, confused. She didn't understand why the man asked that question. Hearing Ray answer, a small smile graced his face, so subtle that even Ray, who stood close to him, could barely notice it. "You may stay as long as you like. Make yourself comfortable," he said after that. Heish was even more surprised than Ray. He'd thought that the man wouldn't let them stay for more than a week, but here he was, allowing them to stay for as long as they liked. Hayes thanked him, then asked what the man's name was. The man didn't spare a single glance towards Heish and answered with his gaze still fixed on Ray. "Cloden Castle," he said while looking at Ray. "It's been a week since their arrival. The weather hasn't changed and it's raining so heavily." The siblings' mood was becoming one with the gloomy weather. Their already sparse conversation dissipating into nothing. Hayes was especially affected by it, his usually energetic smile fading into a stoic face. The menu frustrated him the most. It wasn't suited to his preferences at all. The person in charge of the kitchen ignored every single one of Hayes' requests and cooked with different ingredients every day. Hayes' complaints about the castle grew. At first, he wasn't happy with the number of servants. Lady Mary in the kitchen. Philip, the one who took the siblings inside the manor. Jack, who in charge of the barn, and the gardener that stayed in the annex. Except for these 4 people, there were no other servants in the manor. But they all treated Hayes as if he were a pile of garbage on the street. The second thing he complained about was the master of the house, Cloden. He was very particular. He was kind, but at the same time, he seemed uncaring. It was as if he was keeping them at a distance, an invisible wall blocking them from approaching too close. Even when they had breakfast together for the first time. Cloden told them this: "Don't ever step foot on the 3rd floor." His piercing gaze shifted towards her neck. It looked so tantalizing. Suddenly, his eyes fell on her lips. He told them that only he could be there. His words were contradictory, just like his attitude. He forbade them from coming upstairs, but then told them that he stayed there. What exactly did he want? Ray felt confused by Cloden's behavior. "I'd like to make a proposal," Hayes said to Cloden. For the first time, Cloden bothered to look at Hayes. Excited about the attention, Heish spoke excitedly. "I have a business idea," he said while handing a book to Hayes. Ray knew he would come up with something like that, but she didn't have any faith in him. The sight of him excitedly trying to sell his foolish idea made her lose her appetite. Hayes then told Cloden that he has a friend who has a lot of connections. Even in a war situation, they can still make a good profit. Therefore, if Cloden invests in their business, he will definitely not regret his choice. Hayes' chest swelled with pride, but Cloden continued to calmly flip through the pages, his chin balanced on the palm of his hand. Ray already knew Cloden's answer. Hayes' idea was so absurd that even a child would laugh about it. "Sound good," said Cloden not long after. Ray couldn't believe her ears. She looked at Cloden with a face full of confusion. Cloden looked at Ray, mirth dancing in his eyes. She opened her mouth to question him again, confused as to why he agreed. But Hayes interrupted her, just like always. "I knew it. You've made an excellent choice. Please tell me when you'll have free time, you can visit the place yourself." However, before he could finish his words, Cloden cut him off. But before that, Cloden gave back the documents he had not even read through. "I have a condition," he said to Hayes. Hayes' surprised face turned ashen. He must have imagined something unfathomable. If my investment is not paid back as promised, you have to return it to me, Cloden said. Hayes immediately turned on a pleasant face. It seemed to be an expected line. You are talking about that condition. Of course. I will definitely promise that, Hayes said enthusiastically. Hayes laughed, Cloden smiled. The only one who couldn't smile was Ray. After that, Hayes became busy. After the rain stopped, he went outside the manor, and only Ray remained. She did not have a best friend to visit. Ray was envious of Hayes at times like this. He had graduated from an elite school, knew many people and had several good friends because of his arrogant and yet open-handed personality. Ray let out a small sigh. She watched the rain falling again. This was better than mulling over an insignificant past. A manor that was silent of servants' footsteps and a daily routine of leaning against its windows. The sofa that is placed forlornly in the lobby connected to the sitting room was not tumultuous as if it was a prepared spot. Naturally, Ray killed her time sitting there. She was neither lonely nor sad. Actually, she had dreamed of this peace and quiet for a long time. Lady. A voice she heard for the first time broke the silence. A startled Ray immediately turned back and saw an old woman with her knitting smiling with her teeth showing. Ray had never seen her before. Are you not cold? Do you need a blanket? Asked the old woman to Ray. Not at all. Thanks for asking, replied Ray to the old woman. She seemed to be a servant who was still strange to her. However, the old woman did not leave easily and explicitly implied that she had a different agenda. Why someone like you at a place like this? Asked the old woman to Ray. She looked at the old woman with a confused face. You're still pure. You haven't been tainted yet, she added. You must be careful. Everyone in this manor is looking for a chance to swallow you whole. The old woman came closer to Ray, then grabbed her wrist. A face that would lose her parents early. The sibling from the same womb will end badly. The old woman, who seemed mad, touched Ray's cheeks. This is a cursed place. You should not drink even a cup of water here. Don't make eye contact with anyone. Don't give away your body, especially your heart, said the old woman continuously. Let me go, said Ray, wanting to be released. Only then Ray physically tried to break free from the old woman. But she was more than strong. Ray was becoming scared of the pleasant-looking old lady. Don't ever trust him. He's sharpening his teeth, looking for a chance to suck you dry. I can hear that filthy growling of his all the way here. Listen. Can't you hear him? Said the old woman. Ray was starting to feel irritated. She felt a dislike to the old woman who was ruining her peace that was gotten so preciously. Let go of me. It hurts. Ray screamed to be released. Della. You're scaring our guest, said Cloden in a scary tone. The old woman suddenly became stiff. With her neck creaking, the sound was like that of a wooden doll. Her eyes fumbled over upstairs and let go of Ray's hand. Master, answered the woman called Della with fear. Cloden had a black cigar in his mouth. It went well with his black hair and hid his face in smoke. Instead of a sigh, Cloden let out smoke. Anyone could know it carried annoyance. The situation was serious. The old woman seemed quick-witted, and after straightening her back, she went straight to the door. Cloden laughed with his body half leaning against the banister. It was a dumbfounded laugh. After the door swallowed the old woman who left a powerful residue, only a threateningly strangling silence remained. Ray turned around, she was afraid to look at Cloden. Ray then apologized for making a scene. Ray, Cloden called. Why were you in there in the first place? You know I'm on the 3rd floor, he said, reminding Ray. Before this, he had forbidden her and Hayes to come there. You are charming suffering down there, but I would prefer you to come above, he said to Ray with a smile. Ray unconsciously rolled and grasped the curtains. Again, she felt like she was tethered to him. "But you told me not to come up," Ray stated firmly. Ray hid behind the curtains as if to cover her body. "Are you trying to seduce me?" he said to Ray. And that made Ray embarrassed. "There's nothing for you to do anyway, come here," Cloden called Ray again. Ray was reluctant, even more because of what the mysterious lady warned her. However, as if compelled by some spell, her feet followed him out of her will. A curtain intentionally left behind, fidgeting fingers, flushed eyes. The walk down the hallway was a long one. The pair walked past an almost ancient library, each of its walls lined with shelves full of books. Then, they entered another corridor, tens of portraits hung up on the wall with each one framed with exquisite pearls. As they wandered further into the place, the decor began to look older and older, with some of them dating back to almost half a century ago. "Are you tired?" Cloden asked as he walked ahead of her. "Your pace has slowed down," he added. Ray was so absorbed in observing her surroundings that her pace naturally slowed down. She wanted to look at every single item carefully, taking in the beauty of every minute detail. "No, I'm not," she said. "Good, we're here," said Cloden and pushed the door to open it. He turned around, waiting for Ray to follow him. She stood still outside the entrance, shocked at the sudden appearance of a room. She hesitantly walked in and the door shut close behind her. The room was filled with various things. One wall was packed with books, while the other was lined with little bottles of colored potions. Another side of the room was piled up with accessories that seemed to have been passed down over generations, with dry, wilted flowers woven amongst them. It didn't look like a place where someone lived, rather it seemed more like a storeroom for someone's collections. She could even smell it in the air. His scent was lurking in every inch of the room. Ray secretly took a deep breath. The scent of a young boy playing in the fields mingled with the faint residual smoke of a cigar. The feeling that took over her as the scent washed over her, it was indescribable. "Do you like it?" Cloden said, waking Ray from her reverie. Ray stared at Cloden, her pretty eyes opened wide with surprise. Cloden raised his hands, gesturing towards the surroundings. "This place," he answered to Ray. "Ah, yes. It's nice, everything's very neatly put together," replied Ray shyly. Cloden gently pulled Ray's hand, pulling her close to his body. Ray's breath hitched. This was their first time touching either other. He pulled out one of the books from the shelf in front of him and handed it over to Ray. Ray looked at the book, it was a story book. However, she didn't know what the story was. "Have you ever read this book before?" Cloden asked Ray. Ray felt embarrassed. She couldn't even read the title. The only reason she even knew it was a fairy tale was because of the drawing. "Do you not fancy this book? You've barely even looked at it." Cloden stroked the spine of the book, a smile blooming across his face. "Maybe you think it's childish," he said to Ray. Ray didn't say anything. She was actually interested in the book. It's just that she didn't know how to read it. His soft voice tickled her ears and suddenly, Ray felt an irresistible urge swell up inside her. She wanted to kiss him and gently pet his face. She wanted to caress the graceful figure of the man who kept provoking the forbidden desires buried deep inside her. But the only thing she could manage to do was pull at his sleeves. "Lord Cloden. Read it to me, with your own voice," said Ray with a seductive face. Cloden looked at Ray with a feeling of surprise. He then grinned, there was a meaning behind that grin. She found herself in an awkward position. Cloden plopped down behind her and pulled Ray onto his lap, locking her in his embrace as he wrapped his arms around her. The close proximity left Ray feeling flustered. Her body trembled delicately. She couldn't even bring herself to gulp. "Have you read it before?" Cloden whispered to Ray. Ray didn't speak. She was too afraid of her voice cracking. "How come you are not answering me?" he added. "Can you just read it, please?" Ray said shyly while covering her face with her hands. Cloden didn't even bother opening the book. Ray's neck tickled as his nose brushed against her nape. She began to shrink away from him. This only caused Cloden to grow bolder. Soft lips kissed her neck, sparking a warm, tingling feeling inside her. He lost all interest in the book. Ray tried to pull away, shifting her body around to get away from his touch. But Cloden pulled her closer, trapping her with his arms. He buried his face in her hair, lips still placed on the crook of her neck. A feeling of longing built up inside him as he panted wantonly, yet he restrained himself, or at least, tried to. "Wait, Lord Cloden. This position is uncomfortable," said Ray when Cloden started hugging her. "How?" Cloden replied by bringing his lips to Ray's ear. "The position we're in." Ray shifted uncomfortably in his lap, as if to prove her point. "Like this?" Cloden said while hugging Ray tightly. Suddenly, Cloden's hands clamped down on Ray's thighs as her bottom brushed up against his crotch. The two of them were left at a loss of words. Ray's chest heaved as she took deep breaths, her whole body flushed red with heat. The temperature of the room rose, an intimate heat growing between the two. Ray panted harshly as she entered a feverish trance. Only Cloden's cool lips grazing her cheek providing her with a soothing yet burning relief. "Master. Call the butler from outside." The atmosphere that was once pulsing with pleasure evaporated the moment Philip spoke from outside the room. The old man's hoarse voice snapped Ray out of her trance. "Hayes Lisbon has returned. He wants to see you downstairs." "What do you wish to do?" Philip said to Cloden. The voice outside the door died down, but Philip's presence remained, waiting for his master's answer. "Lord Cloden," he said again when he did not hear an answer from him. Cloden put his head on Ray's bare shoulder. Though it seemed like he'd calmed down, his eyes were wild with desire and his sharp intake of breath indicated that he was far from rational. He just didn't want to let go of Ray, so she pulled away from him first. "Good heavens. Hayes has returned. He must be looking for me," said Ray in a haze, while tidying herself up. However, Cloden didn't want to move from that place. He hugged Ray tightly. This time, his fingers tightly squeezed Ray, and buried his face in her shoulder. He really didn't want to let go of Ray. "Master, should I tell him that you're unable to see him today?" Philip asked again. Cloden clicked his tongue. He felt very disturbed by the presence of Hayes. But he didn't want to make people wait. "Tell him I will be there shortly," he said to Philip. Philip walked away, satisfied now that he had an answer. Cloden leaned forward, reaching past Ray's figure and picked up the forgotten book. He handed it over to Ray. "Ray, I'll lend you this book." "Take it," he said. Ray knew there was no point in accepting the book. It wasn't like she could read it. "What's wrong?" Cloden said when he saw Ray silently looking at the book. He asked if Ray didn't like the book. "I do." "Thank you," Ray replied to Cloden. After all, she can't tell Cloden that she don't know how to read. Although Cloden led the way when they entered the place, they walked right beside each other while going out. The rain had stopped, letting the sun peek through amidst the clouds. The warmth of the sun slowly overpowered the serene petrichor. "It feels so warm," said Ray happily. Cloden looked at Ray and asked, "Do you enjoy the warm weather?" He said to Ray. "Of course I do," Ray answered happily. "Why? What makes you like the warmth?" Cloden said with a curious look. Ray pondered upon his question for a minute. Thoughts flowed into her mind. Warm sunlight shining down upon her, the faint breeze gently ruffling her hair, sleeping out in the open. "Because, if I fall asleep under the warm sunlight, it feels as if I can have a good dream," Ray says that's what makes her like the warm weather. Cloden's gaze shifted to her moving lips, his mind filled with thoughts of what he'd love to do to them. "What about you, Lord Cloden? Don't you enjoy the warm weather?" Ray looked at Cloden while waiting for an answer from him. "Ray? Why are you coming down from there?" Hayes said. Hayes' surprised voice brought her back to reality. Still dressed up from his trip outside, Hayes stared at them from downstairs. "Where are your manners, Ray? How could you do this to him? We're living here for free and you commit such a huge blunder." Once again, Hayes began to make assumptions and treat Ray like an embarrassment. She looked down at her feet, unable to say anything in her defense. Suddenly, Cloden wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Enough. Who's being rude now?" "I was the one who called her over to lend a book," said Cloden. Hayes' face contorted into a frown. "A book? To an illiterate fool like her?" Hayes said that while pointing his finger at Ray. Ray knew she should think nothing of his words. But they still pricked her like little needles. Without her meaning to, tears pooled in her eyes. "Ray, come down here right now. How dare you lie to the Lord?" yelled Hayes from below. She wanted to die of embarrassment. Her secret was revealed. She let go of Cloden's hand, unable to face him any longer. She ran downstairs, bumping into Hayes' shoulder on the way. She didn't care if it pissed him off. All she wanted to do was hide. She ran to her room and jumped on the bed as soon as she entered. She buried her head under the blankets, wanting to crawl into a hole and stay there forever. She was tired of being humiliated by Hayes over and over again. A tear fell down her face and onto the book, the only thing left with her. Mary knocked on the door and came in with food and medicine for Ray. She thanked Mary. Mary would usually send the food and leave. However, not this time. She looked at Ray who was eating and that made Ray a bit uncomfortable. "Lady Ray. You've been in bed for the past 3 days. Is it because of Master Cloden?" said Mary. "Not at all. In fact, it's actually my fault," said Ray to Mary. She was too ashamed of her lack of elegance to face him. But Mary didn't understand her and jumped to conclusions. Mary clicked her tongue. "You must have had a rough time. But what do you accept? Can't you tell by Master Cloden's physique? Tall men are bound to be bigger down there as well." Mary said that with a serious face, and that made Ray even more embarrassed. Listening to Mary's words made Ray remember the incident when she was with Cloden. At that time, Ray felt something poking her from behind, and it made her uncomfortable. She realized what Mary meant, and it made her face red with embarrassment. Mary let out a sigh. "You should see how impatient he's been getting. He's been quite annoyed, so to speak. Especially since you haven't even shown your face. You have to understand. He's still young," Mary said. Ray shyly tells Mary that she has misunderstood what happened. "Nothing happened between me and Lord Cloden," said Ray with a shy face. "Lady, have you never seen a man before?" Mary asked Ray. Well, it was obviously impossible for her to meet any man unless she was trusted to someone. But Mary didn't seem to care about that. She took one look at Ray's expression and mocked her. "There's not a single man in this world who would invest in a business that they're not interested in." "It's because he's your brother," said Mary. Ray hung her head as she considered the implications. He'd do anything to get his money back, right? Then, would they be kicked out if Hayes failed to pay him back? "Will I be asked to leave?" asked Ray to Mary. "Don't worry, Lady Ray," said Mary. Such a thing was impossible. Mary could only laugh at Ray's naivety. "It would actually be the opposite," she added. "Are you not fond of Lord Cloden, Lady Mary?" "I am a mere servant. My opinion doesn't matter," she said. Mary's tone seemed sardonic, yet Ray couldn't find any trace of emotion on her face. No matter what, she couldn't figure out the meaning behind Mary's words. "But the old lady named Della didn't seem very fond of him either," said Ray again. "Well, she's the only person in this manor who can go out and about. Maybe she should consider herself lucky," Mary said in a low voice. "Lady Ray. Don't be too spiteful towards Master Cloden. Think of it as you finally find your person. Maybe it's fate." She pinned Ray with an intense gaze. It was important that she knew this. "Just reminder, Lady Ray. Day after tomorrow I won't be able to stop by. Make sure you stay in your room that day as well, she added. Mary didn't bother explaining. Ray just needed to confine herself to the room until the week was over. And she hoped she'd listen. After a long time, Ray finally came out of her room. She donned her best outfit, a dress embroidered with roses and the only pair of shoes she had. She was planning to use the book Cloden had lent her in order to meet him. She felt guilty for deceiving him. She wanted to tell him the truth and laugh about it with him. Perhaps it'd be fine to let go of her embarrassment. She'd managed to let go of all the burdensome feelings when she was sick, so she was feeling quite optimistic. But before she could make up her mind, she needed to find Cloden. She looked for him everywhere but to no avail. A sudden, soft groan snapped her out of her trance. She looked up, searching for the source of the noise. Her ears led to determine the source to be behind the wall. She held her head next to the wall, trying to catch the sounds. Suddenly, the small ring on the wall caught her eye. Without any hesitation, Ray tugged at the ring. If Cloden was in trouble, she needed to help him. She could hear him breath harshly as she took a step inside the room. A warm, humid gust of air greeted her. The temperature inside the room seemed to be hotter. Ray quietly called out to the owner of the room. Her gaze wandered around the room in search of him. The groans became louder and her eyes were naturally drawn towards their source. Her breath hitched. In front of her, amidst the pool of white blankets, lay Cloden. Ray stood still with shock as Cloden threw his head back, mirth dancing in his eyes as his gaze met hers. He smirked, clearly meaning to ridicule her. He began to play with himself even more passionately, the pleasure evident from his eyes. He came as he moaned her name. His release now splattered across the blanket and pillow, a few drops managing to land on his chest. Cloden slowly calmed himself down and caught his breath. He rose to his full glory and splashed water from the pre-prepared basin on his side onto his face. The soft sound of water sloshing around filled the room as the two fell silent. "Why are you here?" He turned around and pinned her with a cold gaze, speaking to her in a distant tone. Ray stuttered, unable to get the words out of her mouth. Her face burned as her tongue refused to listen to her. "I just wanted to return this." Ray trembled as her body flushed red from head to toe with embarrassment. "Just leave," he said without looking at Ray. Ray concluded that Cloden no longer held any favorable feelings towards her. Is this because he found she was illiterate? He might be thinking that she was no more than a slow-witted, illiterate girl from a fallen noble family, and now she'd even caught him during an intimate act. Of course, he'd find her distasteful. Ray bolted out of the room, wanting to hide her embarrassed self again. Her vision blurred with tears. When she finally felt she was far enough, she immediately collapsed to the ground. She pulled her knees close to her head, wanting to shrivel up. But the longer she cried, the angrier she became. She made up her mind. Ray bit her lips in determination and stormed down the hall, walking back to Cloden's room. She entered the room and found Cloden sitting at the bed, relaxing as he inhaled small puffs of smoke from his cigar. "I'm not sorry at all," she said in a clear, loud voice. "It's not my fault I can't read. I want to read books and write letters too." She continued to ramble. "Do you know how embarrassed I was that day?" she added. Another sob fell past her lips as the tears streamed down her face uncontrollably. The sight of her crying face was quite pitiable. "Why are you only visiting me now?" Cloden said as he approached Ray. He leaned in closer, his warm breath fanning her face. Just a little closer and they'd be kissing, but Ray was so surprised by his words that she didn't even realize the small distance between them. "Because I was embarrassed. I borrowed your book without telling you I couldn't read," replied Ray while looking away. She was worried if Cloden scolded her. "I don't care if you can read or not," said Cloden while stroking Ray's hair. "But I lied to you." Ray doesn't want Cloden to hate her. "Ray, you fooled around with me that day." How do you expect me to interpret your intentions when you don't show up the very next day? Cloden says that, then pulls Ray in his arms. You don't like it? Said Cloden, reminding Ray. Ray shook her head softly. Her tears had finally come to an end. Relief washed over her as she realized that he still cared about her. Cloden closed the distance between them, and in no time, he pressed his lips against hers. He parted her lips with his tongue and passionately ravaged her. Ray felt weak in her knees. He was kissing her so deeply, almost as if he wanted to devour her. If he wasn't supporting her with an arm around her waist, she was sure she would have collapsed onto the floor by now. Their soft lips continued to brush against each other, a warm building inside them. But they eventually had to part to breathe. Ray felt as if she lost a part of herself when his lips left hers. Cloden seemed to have felt the same way, with the way he caressed and sucked at every inch of her face. Lord, wait. Ray tried to calm him down, but his desire was too strong. His stance was firm. He wouldn't leave her alone. Cloden. Ray managed to utter his name. His eyes widened. He was shocked enough to finally leave her face alone for a while. Cloden. This time, she said it with a surge of newfound confidence, rendering him speechless. Won't you read to me, please? She looked at his reaction and smiled shyly. Why are you so pretty? He said. Pretty? No one had ever called as such. Even her parents, who'd raised her with care, had never uttered those words to her. Her brother was a lost cause, he only mocked and ridiculed her. A strong feeling welled up inside her. She couldn't help but like him, the one who noticed things about her when no one else did. Meanwhile, Hayes is on his way home. As he walked, he swore at the incessant rain. Plus the coachman who sent him earlier did not send him to the front of the manor. Now, he had to walk home. Suddenly a farmer appeared from the side of the road. My good sir. The farmer greeted Hayes. Who the hell are you? Replied Hayes angrily. Are you going that way? The farmer pointed to the road leading to the manor. What trick are you trying to play? You're not getting a dime from me. Hayes scolded the man for stopping him. The man explained to Hayes that the place was very dangerous. No one in this village ever goes in that direction. The farmer warned Hayes, then walked away. Not long after, Hayes arrived. Hello, anyone here? Hayes called a servant to deliver food to his room. Hayes took a box out of his pocket. He wanted to give the gift to Ray as a surprise. Goodness gracious. If you heard me, at least you could do was answer me. Hayes was surprised by Philip's presence. Dinner is already over. Philip said that and told Hayes to cook himself with the ingredients available in the kitchen. How can you be so rude? Is this how you're supposed to treat your guests? I spent an hour walking in the cold to get here from that village. Prepare my dinner immediately. Philip paid him no heed and left his shouting figure behind. To him, Heish wasn't even a guest. He was worse than a persistent peddler who kept annoying them. Hey! Stop! Bring me my dinner. Heish was already burning with fury inside. Hayes reached for a vase and threw it at Philip. If you're a servant, then act like one, he said. The vase shattered as it hit Philip, causing him to come to a standstill. He stood like a strong, old tree with its roots buried deep into the ground, unbothered by the blow. Hey! Philip rose from his arched, saggy posture to his full height. He twisted his head sideways as his whole body shook. It was as if he was a snake trying to shed its skin. As his head unnaturally creaked in Hayes' direction, he noticed that Philip's pupils had turned into slits, just like the eyes of a reptile. Green scales began to creep up his neck. And when his tongue slithered out for a split second, Heish immediately noticed its forked end. Fear washed over Heish in cold waves, rendering him unable to move. Hayes suddenly recalled the interaction he had with a farmer in the countryside that morning. Hayes quickly left Philip and looked for Ray, he thought about leaving the place. He looked for her everywhere, eventually reaching the sitting room. His heart almost stopped beating when he saw the sight in front of him. His innocent sister was smiling sweetly at the lord of the manor, leaning towards him as he sat across from her. A cold, sinking feeling of dread churned within him. "Ray!" He yelled with all his might, but his voice never came out. He tried once again, but it was as if something invisible was physically preventing him from speaking. "Cloden, if my brother's business fails and if you lose your money because of that, then would you end up hating me?" Ray said to Cloden. "There's no need to worry about that. Because I always take mine," he said. Although he was talking to Ray, Cloden's gaze was focused on Hayes in front of them. Hayes trembled with fear. He felt like a weak deer who was about to be mauled by a predator. Before this, Cloden had never looked him in the eyes. Hayes now realizes the main purpose of Cloden: he was only after Ray. "Oh. Look at the time. Please teach me the rest tomorrow," said Ray when he realized it was late. "I can't do tomorrow, Ray," Cloden said to Ray. He reminds her of their custom: they are not allowed to leave the room that day. Ray wanted to know about the custom that they often talked about. But she was afraid of Cloden scolding her. But this time she dared to ask. "If you don't follow the custom, will it be a problem?" Cloden didn't reply, choosing to stare at her instead. "I heard it was an old tradition that's been passed down. But it seemed like everyone in the manor hated it," she added. "Ray, if I happen to visit your room, don't let me in, no matter what." His words didn't make much sense to her. Why would she reject his company? "Oh, Sir Hayes," Cloden said while looking at Hayes. Hearing Hayes' name, Ray quickly looked behind her. "Hayes, when did you come back? I was worried because you were gone for a day," she said to Hayes. All Heish could do was stare at her. No matter how hard he tried, no words would come out of his mouth. Cloden pulled Ray's waist, then kissed her hand. As if it was a natural thing in the world to do. "Why aren't you answering your sister? You must be exhausted," he said while looking at Hayes. Hayes felt his insides churn in despair. He wanted to protest, but what could he do? His lips were sealed shut. Seeing Hayes look at her as if he wanted to kill her, Ray pushed Cloden's hand shyly, trying to get him let go of her. To be hugged so intimately in front of her brother, it left her feeling flustered. "Cloden, I should get going." She gave up. It was impossible for her to speak coherently. She hurriedly grabbed the book on the table and ran past Heish with an unbelievable speed, not even looking back once as she entered the dark hallway. After Ray left, Cloden released the restriction he put on Hayes. Hayes let out a deep breath as he felt the restriction lift off of him. "How is your business going?" he said in calm voice. "Let my sister go. This has to do with my business." "She has nothing to do with any of this," Hayes said after the restriction was released. "And where should she go?" "You're not planning on making her sleep on the street, are you?" replied Cloden without looking at Hayes. "Of course she has places to go. She way past her marriageable age. After leaving that place, Hayes plans to find a husband for Ray. He feels that it is safer than staying in that place." "To who?" Cloden asked as soon he heard about the words of marriage. Cloden's face morphed into a strange expression. Hayes felt like Cloden was staring right into his soul. His eyes were blank, devoid of any feelings. It was as if he was a statue made of plaster. A chill ran down Hayes' spine as his heart began to race due to his nervousness. Meanwhile, Ray, who was in her room, let out a sigh. She thought Hayes would yell at her. She breathed a sigh of relief because that didn't happen. Mary reminded Ray again, starting that night, she was not allowed to leave her room. Ray smiled and replied that Cloden already told her about it. "Master told you about it himself?" "What a relief," said Mary. "Is there a problem?" Ray asked Mary. She curious what Mary mean by that. No at all," answered Mary, then asked if Ray wanted to eat something. Because Ray didn't need anything else, Mary said goodnight and left. After Mary left, Ray lay on the bed. She thought that everyone in the manor was behaving mysteriously, forbidding her to leave the room. That made Ray feel puzzled. Ray wanted to know too, but maybe because she was just a guest there, so they didn't want to tell her. Ray didn't want to think too much. She felt grateful for their treatment so far. She was able to enjoy delicious food. She also started to learn to read, was able to meet a good person, and thought of her as the most beautiful person in the world. She recalled the intimate times she had with Cloden. The things Cloden do to her body, she had never felt like that. Compared to the past, Ray felt happier being there. She felt like it was a dream. She didn't want to wake up from it. Ray! Someone called her from outside. The door suddenly quivered forcefully, snapping her out of her thoughts. The thumping noise was too harsh and rushed to be called a knock. Ray opened the door and saw Hayes, who was in a mess. Suddenly, he began to tear up. Slight dread slowly crept up on her. Ray, my dear sister. You have no idea what I had to go through to come here, he said, panting. Seeing Hayes in panic, Ray tries to calm him down and asks what happened. There is no time for this. We have to get out of this manor now, Hayes said, then pulled Ray's hand to leave the manor. Hayes, did you lose all of Cloden investment? Said Ray, who was still confused by Hayes' behavior. Hayes, who was already angry, became even more angry when he heard Cloden's name. That money wasn't worth anything in the first place. Forget about it, we have to leave, he said while pulling Ray's hand. Ray stopped when she heard that. For Ray, with Cloden investment, they can stay there and get through the day without being bothered by debt collectors. Thinking of Hayes failing with his business, that makes Ray very angry. Ray! That's enough. I know you're immature, but how dare you look down on your brother? A loud smack resounded in the room. Ray's cheek burned and she couldn't figure out whether it was due to pain or humiliation. Heish had raised his hand on her. He had slapped her. A lone tear cascaded down her face, but he didn't care. He grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her roughly, almost as if trying to physically shake some sense into her. Do you honestly think he has feelings for you? No. This place is the devil's den. And Cloden is the master of all monsters in this place. He is trying to swallow you up whole. He said that while grabbing her hair. Hayes' wide bloodshot eyes filled her with a sense of terror. She could only assume that Hayes was drunk and out of his mind. He probably lost all of Cloden's money and was now planning to run away because he had nothing to repay him with. It was even worse than what she'd imagined. I'm not going to leave. I'm not going anywhere with you, Ray shouted as hard as she could. You're crazy. You've been completely fooled by him. Hayes was desperate. He wanted to get out of there as soon as possible, but Ray refused to listen to his words. He was fed up with this situation. But so was Ray. Hayes, just apologize to Cloden, okay? Besides, even if we escaped, where would we go? We don't have anywhere else to go. Like it here. Everyone's so nice and kind to me, and that's because they're going to devour you. Hayes cut off Ray's words. That statement, it sounded so illogical, and yet, Hayes said it with a firm conviction. She looked at the wild look in his eyes and gave up on convincing him. There was no arguing with him. Ray, listen carefully. Our parents aren't here, so I'm your guardian now. That means you don't have any right to disobey me. Hurry, follow me right now. This is our only chance, he said while pulling Ray's hand. But Ray was still being stubborn. The moment the sun rises, I'm going to Cloden to ask for his forgiveness. At least one of us should apologize, she added. Are you crazy? How many times do I have to tell you that he's a monster? But before he could finish his words, Hayes went silent and his face turned pale with fear. Who are you? He said while looking behind Ray with fear. Ray looked back. However, she did not see anyone there as Hayes did. Realizing that only he could see it, that made Hayes believe that what he saw was a monster. "Why does it to be me?" he said while slowly backing away. "You can rot here if you want to. But I don't plan on dying here," Hayes said that, then ran as hard as he could, leaving Ray. Ray was too stunned to reply and could only watch as he sprinted out of there. She couldn't even catch him. Her legs gave out and Ray collapsed to the floor. It was time for her to leave this happy life behind. She never should have gotten so attached. Each day, she'd continued to delude herself into thinking that everything would turn out fine. But she should have known her happiness would only last a short while. The ice-cold floor pressed against her legs through the soft pajamas Mary had provided her with. Soon enough, Ray felt a presence loom over her hand. She lifted her head, hoping her brother had changed her mind and come back. Hayes? But she should have known better. There was no way Hayes was going to return. The tall figure standing near her was someone else, and it was Cloden. Ray trembled like a small lamb as she stared into Cloden's eyes. Cold dread seeped into her bones. He knew about everything. She knew nothing would change, but she wanted to come up with excuses to save herself. She didn't want to give him any reason to hate her. "I'm truly sorry. I apologize on behalf of Hayes. I'm sure you're angry. I'll pay back what he owes. I'll work here," said Ray while shaking with fear. "Hayes will come back eventually," she added, even though she's shaking with fear. His words hit her like a punch in the gut. She couldn't bear it. "Hayes, Hayes, all you do is utter his name." Cloden broke into a soft, almost violent, chuckle. "You're acting as if he's your husband or something," he said while holding Ray's chin. "No matter how well I treat you, in the end, all you talk about is him. Hearing his name at the end of every sentence of yours, it makes me want to puke," he said. Ray was too shocked to cry anymore. It was the first time he'd lost his temper in front of her. And she was partly responsible for it. "I'm sorry, Cloden. I'm sure you're upset because of my brother did." Ray could only apologize. She didn't want Cloden to hate her. "I understand why you're angry, but don't act cold towards me." Ray begs Cloden not to hate her. "Cold? I told you not to step outside your room." "I'm sorry. Thing happened, and I had to." Before Ray said it, Cloden pressed his tongue. "Stop mumbling," he said. "Every time you mumble, I want you to suck me," he said again. Cloden then took Ray's hand and led her to the bed. Cloden then kissed Ray like a starving beast, then tore Ray's nightgown. "It doesn't matter whether we do it on the table, in the garden, or in the library. I just want to ravage you and make you submit to me." His hand traveled downwards and came to rest on her chest. "But I held myself back. I want to save some time because how cute and innocent you were. I don't mind teasing you and playing vanilla. But now, I can't hold myself anymore," he said while groping Ray. On that cursed night, Cloden shut the door, blocking out the beautiful moonlight, unwilling to let anything ruin the moment. Now she understood what Mary was talking about. Underneath that kind facade, Cloden had been hiding his wicked temperament this whole time. Ray was flustered at the sudden development and pushed at his arms, but he paid her no heed. "Stop it, Cloden," she said. But Cloden continued peppering kisses on her soft skin, ignoring her feeble protests. She closed her eyes at the strangely pleasurable sensation. Jolts of electricity ran through her body as he nipped at her tender skin, leaving behind stark, red marks. Just when she thought she couldn't handle any more, Cloden gently raked his teeth on her rosy bud and traced its edge with his tongue. When he closed his mouth to suck on it, Ray almost stopped breathing. Ray held Cloden's face, because it was the first time she felt the pleasure. She didn't know what to do in that situation, and she was embarrassed too, not because she didn't like him. Seeing Ray in a seductive state, Cloden couldn't control himself anymore. Just as she finished speaking, Cloden pressed his lips against her. The kiss was downright sloppy as their tongues entangled in a desperate dance of pleasure, and yet, she could sense his sincere feelings. Even when his instincts were threatening to overwhelm him, he was trying his best to be nice to her. Still, she didn't understand how hard he'd tried to avoid this situation. But now that things had come to this, what else could he do? There was a lovely woman in front of him, and Cloden's instincts told him to let go. And so he did. Ray screamed as the bittersweet sensation of pain and pleasure rushed through her body. She knew resistance was futile. There was no way she could get out of this now. It was too late. She finally realized what Cloden had meant when he said he was playing house. Her underwear dangled from her ankle precariously as Cloden sucked at her sensitive folds. She moaned with every swipe of his tongue. His nimble fingers teased the bundle of nerves ceaselessly, making her unable to hold back her voice. Ray's legs flailed about, unable to stay still due to his relentless attack. As the hot sparks of passion burst in every inch of her body, she clenched the sheets in desperation. Although she was begging him to stop, her body shuddered with delight instead. The soft sounds of sucking at her core only became louder as her reactions egged him on. Cloden looked up at her from between her thighs, calmly licking his lips with a smile. "No, it's too much," Ray continued begging to him. But he thought nothing of her begging. If anything, it only made him want to do more. He wasn't satisfied yet. He went back to furiously lapping at her. It was as if he was a desperate dog thirsty for water. "You want me to stop?" he said. Ray nodded in apprehension. "Then spread your legs." Cloden looked down at her gleaming folds in reply. When she noticed where his lustful eyes was looking, realization dawned on her. "No, please don't look at me like that," she said. But since when did her resistance ever work? He began thrusting his fingers inside her again, and Ray could only plead desperately as she felt the familiar tingling sensation build up inside her once more. "Cloden, you weren't like this before. Is this because Hayes escaped? Why are you doing this to me? I told you not to utter that name again." His voice was chilling, daring her to go against him. But before she could sense the warning in his words, the question spilled out her lips. "Why? He's my brother." "So what?" The irritation in his voice was evident. "He may be your brother, but he's still a man. Who knows what he's thinking inside?" He continued toying with her. "I would have waited every night to sneak into your bedroom. Desperate to get test of you." Her legs writhed as he lightly pinched the swollen nub at her core, subconsciously rolling her hips in order to get more of that sweet pleasure. "He hasn't taken you, right? I mean, how can this be your first time?" Cloden seemed aggravated, but it bothered Ray that she didn't know the reason. Even after all that happened, she didn't want him to hate her. She wanted to make sure of it. After all, the only thing Cloden would get out of forgiving Heish was her company. And that wasn't exactly the most precious thing in the world, according to her. "Cloden. Don't you hate me?" she said to Cloden. He stared at her for a while in pity. "Don't you know by now?" Cloden slowly undid his robe, hanging over his arousal. He grabbed her thighs and threw her legs open once again. "Try not to hate me too much," he said. His voice didn't betray any semblance of emotion, but Ray could see the sadness in his eyes. "Things will be easier for you that way." Unable to contain himself, he plunged himself into her. At first, the pain was unbearable. But as he gently began moving his hips, the pleasure began to trickle in. Her body shuddered and clenched around him as he entered her fully. She squealed in protest. Cloden pulled out for a moment to let her catch her breath. But before she could sigh in relief, he began toying with the sensitive numb at her core again. A warm, tingling sensation spread through her. But he couldn't endure it any longer and plunged into her with a harsh thrust once again. "For a person crying in pain, you sure hold up well." He slammed against her hips again. The raunchy sound of their skin slapping against each other followed his groans. He held up her legs, giving him more access to her soaking wet lady garden. "Are you sure this is your first time?" he said. He refused to offer her any more mercy. The way she spread to accommodate him, it was as if they were made for each other. She shivered uncontrollably, causing her to hold on to Cloden's shoulders for support. He could feel it. Her release was near. Her eyes rolled back, and she lost all her senses. Ray thought that they were done. However, Cloden was still full of energy. Why? You want me to stop? Then try begging harder. Cloden brushed his thumb against her swollen nub to stop her from protesting. It was sensitive, so sensitive that she screamed with just a light touch. Tomorrow. Let's continue this tomorrow. How about it? Begging her to Cloden. What? That's it? Ray was flustered by his response and caressed his arm anxiously. I beg you. Tomorrow. Please. You're literally begging me, huh? Cloden expressed his slight annoyance with a sharp jerk of his hips, causing her to cry out in desperation. Her eyes were puffy from all the crying. Her moans provoked him even more, and he immediately grabbed her quivering thighs. He pushed her legs wide open and stared at her gleaming folds. His movements sped up, hungry for her, and unable to be satisfied. After so much pleading, Cloden finally finished. Because it was Ray's first time, she was so tired and fell asleep. Cloden looked and stroked Ray's hair and promised not to never let her go. You were too rough on her. She's a normal person. You shouldn't have gone that far, Mary said while wiping Ray's body. Gone that far? Take a look with your own eyes, he said to Mary. He looked at Ray. With Ray's seductive beauty, how could he control himself? Still, you should leave her alone for a couple of months. I don't know if she'll be able to handle what's going to happen to her in the near future. As soon the words fell out of her mouth, Mary immediately regretted her words. Cloden released his aura, rendering Mary unable to move. Mary, who fell on the floor shaking, apologized to Cloden. You keep forgetting where you stand, Cloden warned her. Ray was woken up by Mary's scream of pain. Ray woke up confused as to what was happening. Suddenly the atmosphere became quiet, Mary's screams were no longer heard. Cloden tried to touch Ray, but, spontaneously, Ray avoided him. You're avoiding me? Cloden said with a disappointed voice.